Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first online session of our exclusive roundtable called The Perspective. My name is Ankit Bansal, and I'm the founder and CEO of Sapphire Human Solutions. We are one of the top 10 retained executive search firms in the country. We've been holding these perspective roundtables for almost over a year now, and we've had 10 extremely successful editions with fantastic panelists, speakers, and great participants in the past. And to provide us the perspective and talk us through her wealth of experience, we have today with us one of the most eminent, highly sought after board personality, Mrs. Neera Saggi. Neera doesn't really need an introduction. I'm just still going to try and give you one, Neera. Sorry for that. She joined the Indian Administrative Service in 1980. Some of the assignments that she has undertaken is being secretary to the governor of West Bengal, district magistrate of Hooghly, deputy chairperson of JNPT, CMD of Hindustan Diamond Corporation, and development commissioner of special economic zones. She's also been the chief executive officer for L&T Seawoods. She was the first woman president elected for Bombay Chamber of Commerce and Industry, which is one of the oldest clubs in the country, chambers in the country. She sits on the board of Honeywell Automation, GE T&D, GE Power, Tata BSL, Tata Projects, Swaraj Engines, and Care India. She holds an MBA degree and also has a master's degree in English literature from Delhi University. Since we can't give a round of applause, can I request everybody to give a big thumbs up to Neera? Thank you, Neera. Thank you so much for sparing your time and spending us. She in fact joins us from London, but she was kind enough to agree and do the session for us. Thank you so much, Neera, for being with us today. I'm going to call out our brilliant participants. If I can, jump in straight now, what was your first reaction as a person, when you heard about COVID and the associated lockdown? What was your reaction?
Ankit, first, let me compliment you for getting a very cohesive and a very diverse group present today, starting from pharma to non-profit to banking and finance. We have it all. I'm glad to be a part of it. Yeah. Now, coming specifically to your question, I think all of us almost reacted in a similar manner. It was something surreal. We never really thought what had hit us is going to have long-term impacts. Even initially, I remember when the Prime Minister talked about a lockdown, it was only for a certain number of days. We had thought of 14 days, that it would become such an unending saga. Personally, I doubt very many of us had anticipated that. So that's what I would say was my reaction. Of course, the times unfolded totally differently.
So these times have required director duties to assume different levels of importance and significance, right? What is your view in terms of how have, board members' responsibilities changed during these COVID times?
The most important thing, I think, has been for the board to keep its balance. That has become a very, very important aspect, especially in these times of ambiguity. There's ambiguity all around. The management is struggling with that. And at this time, the most important responsibility of the board is to reflect a sense of balance, both within its internal deliberations and also in its communication of how it communicates to the other stakeholders, including the management. Otherwise, if you really look at it, the role of the board doesn't really change. The role of the board is you have to look at strategy, you have to look at compensations, you have to look at HR. And, at the IT, you have to look at it. But how do you react to it at this moment? The first part that really stuck all of us, and it stuck the management also, was that how to go back to where we were pre-COVID times. That was a refrain that all of us were making and all of us were hearing. But slowly, over a period of time, we realized that the matter was much more deep-rooted. The things that had really hit us were supply chains, labor, employees, work from home. There were so many imponderables which we had never imagined, especially the management had never imagined that these things would come. So the responsibility of the board became at that moment to ensure some kind of a stability, to come to a level where you can at least come back to a near normal, if not the full normal. But I think now the time has passed to a large extent, and now the time has come for revaluations and resetting. Now we are looking at resetting, at least in some of the boards that I am, in most of the boards that I am. The worst seems to be behind us, or rather we know how to navigate ourselves through the worst. And unless there's another severe lockdown or a severe wave next, we know how to proceed forward and work towards that. So that became a very important point for the board to guide the management, and most important, to give it a sense of comfort. See, the board's management was also dealing with matters which it had never dealt before. And if at that time the board raised uncomfortable questions, it would have been not right. That was the time when the board had to change its attitudes. And rather than too much of questioning, it had to go with the flow and change its course and maneuvers sometimes even within 15 days. Today you realize this is the story, and tomorrow you realize it's different. And I remember in many of the boards, we were asking on not for one scenario, but 2 or 3 scenarios. Things like annual plans went for a toss. I mean, there was nothing that you could say. I mean, what you were talking about was you were setting the new annual plan every 1 month. You didn't know what will happen. So being flexible was one of the biggest things that the board had to reflect and also communicate it to its members.
Right. So, I mean, for the sake of all of us, what are the top 3 priorities of the board, and how did they change during these COVID times? In your mind, what do you think are the top 3 priorities of the board?
You see, when the board was earlier talking of HRs and compensations, it was not looking beyond the CEO and the one level below him. And of course, the general policy of compensations in the company, how much should be the variable pays this time, what should be the criteria for identifying how variable pay is to be distributed, whether it should be division specific or it should be organization specific. But now you suddenly realized at the lowest level, starting with the migrant labor, that is where the HR really started. You never really thought about it. And earlier when HR was only coming for his own functions to brief the board, mostly to the NRC, here the HR person became one of the most important communicators to the board, that how is he ensuring stability? Stability in ensuring the workforce, stability in ensuring their safety and security. That was so important. Safety regarding their insurances, regarding, ensuring work from home, then skilling people to be able to work from home. The top level must have been very skilled, but it was not necessarily all down the line was skilled on that. So a lot of emphasis initially shifted to the staff. It shifted to the HR. And then, like I said, the second important thing that concerned, and that here really the audit committee became very useful, was the liquidity. The liquidity and the cash flows, that became very important. Some companies had reserves, but not very many had reserves. Many looked at banks for meeting their needs, and the banks were not in a position to really service you at that moment. Also, don't forget that the pandemic came at a time when India already was struggling, where the economy was concerned. And to add the worst part to it, it was in March, when the end of the financial year. Yeah. I mean, I remember troubling the CFOs, the board repeatedly asking him, what are the disclosures I give now? What does the board say? How much has been the COVID impact? How much has been the COVID impact? And I can understand him being so terrified about it, because really for him to be able to evaluate, not really knowing what is there in future and whether he will be hauled up later that, look, you did not make full disclosures. Many things like this really stuck you, which you had never thought of earlier.
Right, right.
So besides HR, then the financial cash flows, the financial disclosures, and the third most important thing became communication. How do you communicate with your stakeholders, with your business partners? When are you going to be able to deliver them? Are you able to connect with your supply chain, and are you able to get your supply chain materials? Then let us say, being able to understand how the governments are thinking, how the government, the financial institutions, how is the RBI thinking? How is the government thinking? Is the lockdown going to be more intense, more deep? Is it going to be longer? And then how the social fabric around you is thinking. Is your migrant labor going to come back? The improbables that you had never thought of earlier became the critical part for the board to analyze and evaluate. And there, the deep experience of the board became important, to guide the management that, look, this scenario could turn in this manner, and guide and work towards it. Of course, no one really knew what would happen finally, but definitely identify a few scenarios which could be useful yardsticks to move forward on.
Where did companies fall on their PCPs? Or was there's nobody who could have envisaged, a scenario like this in their PCPs?
You see, in the companies that I was associated with, in some of them, the risk analysis functions were very strong. So there was an emphasis on disruption on productivity and continuity of work. But that it would be 100% or absolute, no one had thought of those scenarios. I mean, you could think of there would be a more dip in the economy. We were preparing for that. Many were not preparing, but anticipating that. So you could think of a 10% scenario or a 20% scenario. But to say that 100% you would be locked down and you wouldn't be seeing anyone's face, that was absolutely unexpected. And the cash flows would become zero. That's no one expected. No one expected. So I would be very surprised. A few feelers started coming when we heard about China. And we did hear something from Europe, because there it started before us. So a few feelers started coming, and especially the MNCs started to some extent, thinking that it would be a possibility that would be hitting India. But the turnaround was too fast. Too fast. I don't even think even a board meeting was called, till the lockdown really hit us in the face. I don't know if the experience with the participants was different, but that's how I saw that.
Right. So risk scenarios, companies' preparedness on handling risk, was it one of the first things that, everybody started looking into? Or was it something that, started coming the Q2 aspect of it, where first was more around firefighting issues like HR, like you said, communication to stakeholders? Where did risk stand in all of this?
I think the first most important part was to get continuity. You see, because risk analysis had already been done. Now, one major risk has come to you. It has come in the risk analysis, it's come on the right, topmost, it's the most, and you have to deal with it. So the biggest part at this moment was how to, first of all, to ensure safety and security of your people, to ensure that they are safe. And very many companies also ensured that their families are safe.
Can I request? Thank you.
Yeah. So to be safe, I think that became the biggest priority. And second priority became to start continuity in work. That was most important. And that entailed a lot of things. So many companies, I think, set out one committee which started looking at safety, security, employees, migration, staff coming back, work from home, how to handle that. And the other committee, or rather the chief executive and along with him, 3 or 4, 5 key people started looking at ensuring continuity. And that was also a lot of things, trying to get in touch with your stakeholders, especially your suppliers, your business partners, your financiers. So all that work had to start. And I would say that a lot fell on the management at this moment to again start. It was almost like starting a new venture after your infrastructure was ready. You know, I mean, that aspect of setting up the infrastructure was not there. But if your infrastructure is ready, you have to start it. And that kind of an effort was needed. After that, of course, now when we will be doing the risk analysis, how we are going to look at future is going to be totally changed. You know, it's going to be now also expecting not at 10% level, 20% level, but at very deep-rooted levels, and not only industry-related risks, which we were very good at looking at, or macro India economy-related risks, but you are going to realize that a lot of global risks, which are not only economic, but even related to health and sustainability, are going to can hit you at any stage of your working.
So, we've seen these 6 months of, can I request others to please put yourself on mute, please? Mahesh, Radha, if I can request you to please, thank you so much. So, we've seen 6 months, and like you said, things were changing pretty much on a monthly basis, if not on a weekly basis, right? How was management's thinking in Q1, and how is it now that we're talking almost at the end of Q2? What was management's views? Did you, in any of your boards, realize that management's views were different from the board's view? How were those things managed? Your thoughts on all that.
I have seen almost a sense of comfort now coming in. What one saw initially, the management was worried. The management was worried for the safety of its people, and also not knowing when it would be able to start operating. So the first 2 or 3, 4 months were difficult. Fortunately, in the first quarter, in the financial closure of the last year, it was only 15 days impact. So the results didn't look all that bad. And it was not as if, if we had been 3 months in the COVID, and the results would have been really, had gone south very much more drastically for the last financial year, the management have been more disheartened, the board would have been more worried. In that sense, we were fortunate because it was only 15 days and the impact of the COVID was there. But yes, they were very, very conscious of the fact that we don't know what next few months and for how long. But now I think things have settled down to a large extent. Certain sectors are showing very healthy growth. Certain sectors are seeing some interests which are flowing back. But it is not as if it is all quiet all over. And I would also say that the government has also, by at least its statements, given a sense of comfort. The RBI has been very proactive. The loans restructuring, interest waivers, that has given a sense of confidence. And most important, there are certain regulations which the government has deferred. For example, in the power industry, we were supposed to do for the thermal plants, the FGD, for the sulfur control, within a certain period of time. They've extended it to 2022. That period was. So they are also realizing that there were certain constraints that the industries are facing today. We need to let them resolve that first before we put the pressure of external expectations on the industries today. So management in that sense is now more in control. They are more confident, and they feel, most of them, almost all of them that I am associated with, feel that the worst is behind them.
So some positive words are there. Board meetings. We've always had 1 or 2 people join in virtually, right? But this time, the entire board meetings went virtual. So I want to know, what was your experience of doing these virtual board meetings? What were some of the things that were good about these virtual board meetings? What were the things that you didn't like? And do you think going forward these meetings are going to go fully virtual, given it saves a lot of time and effort on part of board members to come together at one place?
Initially all of us were very grateful that we could do virtual board meetings. We were all secure, wanting to be safe ourselves. So we were very grateful that we could do it from home. And the LIDOR regulations that had come in that we could do it made it so much more comfortable. However, I would say that to continuously do board meetings virtually perhaps is putting too much of struggle on the boards themselves. See, how are the boards really, how do they really function? Whenever the government or whenever the regulator looks at the board, it talks of it as a joint and a collective responsibility. A joint and a collective responsibility cannot only be virtual. When you meet people, you talk, you discuss, you go online, offline, you meet for lunches, you spend a full day together. The chemistry is different. Your way of interacting is different. Your ability to take matters aside is different. Now here, the moment you step in, the recording starts. You're conscious of each word that you're talking about. And, just ensuring that the regular agenda is finished fully. So I would say that while I know many of the CEOs are very grateful that virtual meetings are there and they would like to continue it forward, the expenses are much less, the travel times are much less, but over a period of time without human interaction, I don't think it is a very successful experiment. It could be for certain periods, you do it once or twice, some of us do it, but not regularly, because the nuances, especially when the government expects you to pierce the veil, to be able to look beyond what the management is telling you. All that is very essential when you interact together. I also know now of CEOs who are putting in some flight times. For example, that they're looking, keeping some time separately where they can think and interact with themselves, which they used to do when they were taking flights. Or they have given their staff water cooler times. In one of the companies that I'm associated with, just half an hour or 40 minutes of water cooler once a week, so that a group of staff can get together and just chit chat, so that they keep connected, they keep together, and they keep discuss things which go beyond the meetings, is become a norm. So I would say that nothing can be a substitute for physical interaction. But yes, in these times, it was very welcome and it was a very big support to be able to do that.
To be able to do that. Okay. Now, you were on different boards, Neera, and you've seen different management responses, right? Different companies have reacted also slightly differently. Everybody has have their own style and strategies. Anything that stood out for you? Any best practices which you really thought that it was extremely good, forward thinking on part of the management? Anything that you would want to talk about or highlight?
In some companies that I was associated with, the humaneness that came forward, especially when the migrant labor was stuck in the factories and they were not able to go home for some time, the amount of support and the amount of facility an effort was being made in spite of the lockdown to provide that I really think stood out for me. In some other companies, I thought, their abilities to cut costs and bring them down to the bare minimum and also take a cut, so that they realized their cash flows were under threat. They did not have many reserves to pull back on. And to be able to rise to that occasion, to be able to support the company without really very many of murmurs. The third thing that I saw was that many unexpected stars shone in the company. You realized that many people that you had thought were not of that potential were the ones who could hold hands, take the responsibilities on their shoulders, and most important, ensure flexi timing when, let us say, if, a group was not able to perform well, take part of their responsibilities, carry the whole group through. So that kind of things I saw in the companies coming through. So many stars shone out. A lot of financial modeling was done, which ensured that. And the CEOs, I think in one or two CEOs I saw really went out to touch base with all stakeholders to ensure that the continuity comes back as fast as possible. And one good practice I saw in another company was that to SMEs, they ensured that it doesn't stop the payments to them wherever they could manage, however much they could manage. It might not be full payments because they realize that if this supply chain is finished, we will suffer in the future. That was, I thought, a very good practice, that looking beyond your coffers, looking at someone else who you think needs to be supported to take you forward, to work with you in future and not leave them in the lurch.
We are all much smarter in hindsight. Anything that you think you or the board that you were part of would have done differently in the last 6 months?
I think we could have shown less anxiety. The boards could have shown less anxiety. We came under too much of, pressure from the surroundings around us. And sometimes I think questioned that CEOs and managements a bit too much. Every 10 days, I want to know, what are you doing about the COVID response on staff? Every 15 days, we should have a call with HR. When they were also firefighting, I think we could have been a little more comfortable to deal with ambiguity, knowing that things are happening, things will change. Let the management handle it. Just keep a strong oversight and become a good, I know one or two chairmen and boards, which became very good sounding boards for the management. But that is what the board needed to be at this moment. A good sounding board, rather than a person who was trying to totally safeguard the interest of its minority shareholders, of its governance practices, of everything that we have learned all the time, and evaluating every action of the management on those criteria. Those criteria don't fall away, but they were not the ones on which every action at this moment had to be, questioned or or analyzed.
I'm sure a lot of people on this platform will be appreciating what you just said, because they would have been on the other end of it. So do you think, what are the fundamental changes, COVID has brought about, which you think are going to be here to stay as far as, corporate governance or boardship is concerned?
First of all, of course, how we look at risks will be different. It will be totally different. Like I mentioned earlier, it would not be related to your own organization. It will be related to much larger, deeper things, because we realize that much more can impact us than, how, only your businesses. Also, I also think that your supply chains will undergo a change. Earlier, those 1 or 2 or 3 supply chains that you depended on, especially the ones that were in a distance. I know in one of the companies that I'm associated with, very key component had to come from Chennai, and the company was based in North India. So there was absolutely deadlock. There was no way we could get it. So looking at a bit different kind of a supply chain is something that we would have to. Second, I think we would also have to work as our HR practices. We will have to be very clear that how do we handle the HR from now? How do we skill them? How many do we make to work from home? How many need to come to offices regularly? What will be our office space requirements? Will that be sustainable, what we are talking about? How, in spite of that, then not only the logistics of working from home, but also the culture and the practice of working from home. That, for example, how do you ensure that there's robustness of the IT systems? How do you ensure that the culture of giving their best performance after the pandemic has passed and still working from home continues? It's not an easy job. How do you evaluate? How do you monitor? How do you assess performances? So your HRs will undergo a change. Your IT will definitely undergo a change. I'm sorry, and I'm sure the women who are here, the ladies who are here there with me will appreciate that. In one of the companies, and it's a very reputed company, the CEO said very he was being very, he said that we're putting such systems that will enable now that everyone can work from home. I said, but what stopped you from putting them 5 years back when women wanted to work from home? At that time, you all said it was so difficult. But now the will is there. Now it's there. Now it is the responsibility now that is coming, is that we work from home, but we ensure that the systems and the processes around them become more robust so that there is seamless working and there is transparent working and there is cohesive working. 3 areas which will become a challenge. And I think the third thing is, another thing is companies will become less leveraged. Less leveraged. They will increasingly realize that you don't really know how, our abilities to pay debts, interests, so they will become less leveraged. And the companies that are more cash rich at this moment are going to get a much bigger advantage in M&As and other things, because this is the right time for them to be able to do cherry picking. So a number of companies will be able to change their structures, in their business models as they will be amalgamating or moving out of businesses. I see a lot of that going ahead, many will. I also see a relook at the equities. Many companies which had small equity base, but were doing very well, were scared at this period that we are a sitting duck for takeover. So perhaps an expansion of equity is what I think might be on the cards. So these are some of the changes that I think the boards will look at. And, of course, in hindsight, we will also learn how to handle a black swan event like this. The next black swan might not be similar, but at least it's given us a lot of guidance on what can go wrong in an organization and how best to keep it under control as much as possible.
Got it. Neera, I can go on and I'm sure we love hearing you every time you speak, and such insights, great insights, deep insights. But now I'm going to just open up the floor for everyone. We are all avid users of Zoom by now, so all of you know how to raise hands in Zoom. So if you can just raise your hand within Zoom. But for starter, and the first one, if you can just do a simple old-fashioned hands up, I'll just point out, and then we can go ahead with your set of questions. So can we start with Amit, and then others, if you can just raise your hands within Zoom, please. Thank you. Amit, your question.
Neera, thanks for the time and engagement. I think I really take back some really good learnings across the different industries that you just shared. And since you have an exposure to different industries, I also wanted to check, did this event actually throw up some business opportunities, in some specific industries? And how do you see those specific industries capitalizing on this? So any thoughts on that? Any industry which actually benefited and was able to capitalize on this event?
To say that the industry benefited, it would be a very large sweeping statement, but definitely certain people certain entrepreneurs benefited from it. For example, in the infrastructure sector, the road assets were up for grab. Many international companies moved in, Brookfield moved in, many of them moved in, many funds moved in, and they took in a lot of road assets and they bought it on their books. The InvIT started coming in. So in the infrastructure sector, I definitely saw some of them moving in. That is where mainly my experience would be in infrastructure sector. In FMCGs also we saw in the recent past that some of the very profitable brands, Hindustan Lever itself picked up a lot from GSK. It picked up Horlicks, it picked up those brands. And as a result, this time the result of Hindustan Lever has been almost 9% above the last quarters. Not the last quarter, the equivalent quarters in the last year. So many of those brands came up for sale. Now, whether it was GSK did it because of some other requirements or financial requirements or some other reasons, but the fact is at this moment, these transactions did take place. Did take place. Also, you see people like buybacks had become so prominent now. Many companies are delisting because they want to have more equity in that. And I'm seeing that even with one or two MNCs that are doing that they're delisting because they do not want to have the 25%, shareholding of the public and take over the whole thing. So I think a number of opportunities are coming, but in different spheres. A lot will come in the PSU, but that is when the government makes up its mind and starts moving. But looking at the space, the resource constraint of the government, it has to.
My question are basically in two parts. One, I would be more futuristic in nature. Presuming COVID, the worst of COVID is already behind us, as we all sense that. Post-COVID era, how do you sense the role of an independent director changing? And that question has two parts. Not only COVID, also with the new kind of responsibilities with the Companies Act and the government specifically looking from the independent director. The role is expanding a lot. And how do you prepare an independent director, prepare for meeting those challenges effectively and deliver on the responsibilities?
I am from a government background. I spent a number of years with the government. And we used to jokingly say in the IAS that there is no responsibility of a DM. The district magistrate or the district collector, as you call him, you all are familiar with this, this role in its countrywide. Everything starting from floods, going down to law and order, elections, rural development, everything falls on his head. He's responsible for nothing, he's responsible for everything. I think somehow the Companies Act, and I have been saying this pre-COVID, and this is not a statement post-COVID, the government has to be very clear that what is the role of the independent directors. As of now, it is expected that it is almost as if the independent director is an executive director, which he is not. The independent director and the board are responsible for a few very strategic things. They are responsible for strategy and vision, for governance, for HR, and compensations. That's how I would put it. And of course, communication to the stakeholders, that the communications that are going are true and accurate. Now, this is very all-encompassing. And within that, in 4 or 5 or 6 meetings, it is not possible for an independent director to look at every ledger and every accounting entry. So a good balance is what the board would need to bring about, and the Companies Act will have to veer towards it. So this is where our Companies Act has to be more robust and be very clear on what it expects from its board and from its independent directors.